Hello everyone, welcome to Bruno's MMA show. Lots of champions retiring, or at least, saying they will, because one imagines they want to be paid like champions. Crazy, right? So, you know, we've spoken about Henry Cejudo already on this show. Um, we mentioned it in the two-part episode with Mark Hunt. And John Jones has said he retired since then. And it's just this thing that seems to be really catching on. Someone else said he was retiring. Someone who doesn't currently have a belt, and who decided to announce his retirement for the third time in 4 years, stealing attention away from Amanda Nunes and her title defense. So let's not even mention that person's name, because it's kind of cheap to for that person to be like, oh, now that there's a UFC event, I'm gonna steal all the attention to me. Dude, enough. You already have a huge chunk of the market. Like, enough of that. So Amanda Nunes, let's talk about her instead. She said she might retire, and of course, Dana White's reaction was to complain about it, like, oh, makes no sense to build a division for her or something like that. I don't know. He said something along those lines, like he couldn't comprehend why it was happening. It's so funny. Uh, Here's the thing about Amanda Nunes. There's something related to her that was kind of like the sometimes you look back at things and you kind of, oh, there were signs that this was coming, except at the time you didn't recognize them as signs. So let's go back in the past, not too far back, but just a little bit, when Nunes defeated Chris Cyborg. And here's the thing. I'm very direct about this. If any fighter has taken steroids in the past, in my personal opinion, I dismiss them from greatest of all time conversation. But it doesn't mean that I dismiss them as people or as fighters going forward. It's kind of complex. Like, if they did that in the past, don't do that anymore. I'm not gonna hold it against them forever. So I like Chris Cyborg, basically. I like her, really do. But I would say when Amanda Nunes defeated Chris Cyborg, like, I was like, okay, Amanda Nunes is the greatest of all time female fighter for sure. And here's another stat about Amanda Nunes, by the way. You know how big of a deal it was for everyone that Tony Ferguson went on a 12-fight win streak before Gaethje stopped him. Amanda Nunes is now on an 11-fight win streak. That is insane. She's thinking about retiring because, I think there's two aspects of this. So, Chris Cyborg, she wanted to do the rematch with Amanda Nunes, but she wanted more money. Does this sound familiar? Does this sound familiar to fans right now with what's going on in MMA right now? What did Dana White do? He treated Chris Cyborg like crap. Because that's the only way he knows how to treat fighters. When they ask their worth. When they ask what's due to them, that's the only way he knows how to treat fighters. So Chris Cyborg left for Bellator. Yeah. So, Amanda Nunes just went through Felicia Spencer. easily. And the only rematch that makes, like, the only fight that makes sense well, I mean, not the only one, but let's say that the fight that makes the most sense for Amanda Nunes right now is a rematch with Chris Cyborg. But because of how Dana White treated Chris Cyborg, she's in Bellator now. Yeah. So look at it from 2 points of view for Amanda Nunes, and Dana White's all flabbergasted by this. Well, let's have a look. At a time when a lot of champions are retiring, because they ask for more money. Now, Amanda Nunes says she's thinking about retirement. Read between the lines. Dana White, if you don't want her to retire because you need her for women's MMA, which you do, pay her. But let's go with another argument, and maybe both combined. Like maybe it's a little bit of both. Let's go with something else here. What if she's just not motivated anymore? She went through like so many female fighters. None of them are at her caliber, except maybe, like, how about Chris Cyborg? That's a fight that a rematch would make sense. Like she clearly won last time, but I mean, like, if there's someone who you're gonna put in front of Amanda Nunes and be like, yeah, there we go, that might work. It's Chris Cyborg, but she wanted more money, and now Dana White. So it's a domino effect, And here's the thing: in the short term, it makes sense to want to save money, and for a businessman. And even in the long term, you could argue like, oh, you lose these champions, but in the long term, you don't have to pay them more. The next ones. So that's another logic that seems to make sense long term. Except at some point, here's what's going to happen. The next champion caliber fighters might go elsewhere at the beginning of their careers, seeing all of this happen. I know, it sounds crazy, right? But hear me out. What if UFC is not the dream anymore? What if it starts losing its shine, its luster? Let's say a fighter who would get, like, I don't know, like, now I know that Bellator like had Aaron Pico, didn't turn the way they thought it would, but that was like a guy who was starting in Bellator right away. Was like, okay, this guy is gonna be something. Let's grab him now. And okay, we'll see what happens with Aaron Pico. I'm still very interested in his career. Like he's had setbacks for sure, but my point is, other organizations might not be able to pay as much right now, or maybe one could actually, yeah. But I don't know. Like, let's say other organizations can pay the same as UFC can right now for current champions. But imagine starting fighters who don't see the UFC as this like dream goal anymore, unless when they come to that point they get paid that. But let's say like starting out, an organization is willing to snatch them up for like a better price now that the UFC would pay for them starting out, and then they build them up there, but they become like really popular, highlights and all that, and they through those fighters becoming more popular, that organization becomes more popular. Suddenly they might have more money to spend. It's a slippery slope. Here's the thing: I really think that right now the eyes are on the UFC, and to save a few million, they're compromising the level of quality perceived in UFC. So right now people are still thinking that only UFC fighters are high caliber fighters. There's a lot of people who still have that mentality that any fighter not in the UFC is not a world level fighter. Like, okay, whatever. That's a perception. So it brings us. So if we look at Chris Cyborg wanting more money for a rematch with Amanda Nunes, then Dana White going like, she didn't want to fight Amanda Nunes, all of that, and Chris Cyborg going like, no, I wanted to fight her. I just wanted to be paid more. It started there. And the consequence is seen now. Because whether it's through lack of motivation at this point for Amanda Nunes, because there's no one left to fight for her in the UFC, or because, like, she has enough money to retire and going back to it at some point now that she's gonna have like a family, like for it to be worth her time, it would have to be more money, I imagine. So all of this and now Dana White is like flabbergasted that she's thinking about retirement. Well, yeah. See, that's how it happens. That's how it starts. That's how you lose by not wanting to lose a few million. You might like UFC might end up losing a lot more in perception, in quality, and fighters might start going elsewhere. If only just because they can be so headstrong. Believe me, I think that some of them will just go elsewhere, and maybe those trapped in contracts right now can't. But in the long run, it's not looking good. And it all started with Chris Cyborg. I see the pattern. I just see it. It's a domino effect. And right now, Amanda Nunes, I really think Amanda Nunes is about to retire because there's no more big money fight for her. No, interesting. Like, Dana White didn't see what he had in front. Like, he didn't see what he had. He didn't appreciate it when it came to Amanda Nunes and Chris Cyborg rematch. And that's what happened. So, yeah. I don't know. What happens to women's MMA now. It's. I mean, obviously there's other great female fighters other than Amanda Nunes, but you know, if Amanda Nunes does retire, first of all, congratulations for her, and what a loss for the rest of us, right? The warning signs were there. They were there a while back. That attitude that Dana White had with Chris Cyborg and that rematch and not wanting to pay what it was worth is now costing women's MMA, and the whole attitude overall is costing MMA in general because now we're seeing the other fighters reacting. Overall, I'm not saying anything that wasn't already said when it happened with Chris Cyborg. I'm not saying anything that overall hasn't been said already by many others, but I think I haven't heard anyone make that connection right now in the present to what happened before. And I wanted to just put it out there. So yeah, interesting times. Interesting times. I've become very disgusted with the UFC. And I remember my interview with Mark. I mean, the company, not the fighters, not the fights. And it's not way, not like just how they treat the fighters. Everything that's coming to light. And just some of the comments on my Tim Sylvia interview are pretty discouraging. And the only ones are removed were comments where people went too far in the comments, but overall, even comments that I really disagree with, I'll take a moment to reply soon. But I'm not the type to censor people, so I'll just reply to those instead very soon when I have a moment. And like for those who haven't seen my Tim Sylvia interview, he broke his arm during a UFC fight, and he had like a metal plate, and now it's kind of coming out, and he needed, when they called UFC again to pay for that operation, the UFC refused because Tim Sylvia is no longer under their employ, and a lot of people had the attitude of like, well, they paid it back then when he broke his arm in that fight, and he continued fighting since then, so now it's up to him to pay it. It's his fault. Also, a lot of comments asking, didn't he make money already there? Like, because they didn't watch the full video and they commented, of course. But no, I don't agree to that. I think if he broke his arm in that fight with the UFC should always pay for that specific operation, because it's kind of weird that people are like, "Whoa, he continued fighting," but yeah, what is he supposed to do? Retire because he broke his arm once? No. that wound compromised his whole ability to make money and continue his career. Therefore, especially if he has to keep fighting, the UFC is responsible for that, in my opinion. It's even more of a reason. People seem to think like, oh well, he continued elsewhere. No, no, no. It's even more of a reason because now going forward, that wound is everlasting, is ever needing to be fixed. Therefore, it's even more their responsibility, whether he works for them or not. Still, that's my opinion. And look, I don't need to agree with everything that people think or say. Or um, Tim Sylvia is a Republican, and he's he's a fan of Trump. I hate Donald Trump, and even in that interview, I gave my opinion. I said, look, I not to get too political, but I like that here in Canada, the health system pays for that. So it's not like I shy away from giving my opinion, but like I'm not gonna dismiss someone over political opinions like that because I think it's important to address the issue at hand. That man got hurt and should continue to be paid by the company. Um, that should cover it, really. Like I don't, it shouldn't be like that. They shouldn't treat their ex champions like that. Um, but of course, I'll bring up like it would be much better if the health coverage, like if health the health system was like in Canada. Believe me, I'm Canadian. It does not turn us into a communist country, unlike what some people think. But it's like you can certainly give your opinion on things and also respect what the person is going through. I guess I'm replying to some comments now. Mark Hunt brought up that what people should do is boycott the events. Now, I don't know if I agree to that. I think fighters should get together and get a union going, or the Ali Act, or whatever it takes. That's what I think is the real fix: is fighters getting together. And I think it might happen now. We'll see. But as fans, I don't know that boycotting the UFC would really help in the sense of the contract that they have with ESPN at the moment for next few years. I think it's for a few years. Um, I think the real solution is fighters getting together. If fans boycott the sport, I don't think the response is going to be let's pay them more. I think it's going to be like, well, there's less money to be made. I think it's going to hurt the fighters if we don't pay for the pay-per-views, if we pirate the fights, because the UFC is not being fair. But at the same time, if we don't even send some money that some of the fighters, at least the champions, would make with the pay-per-views, like it's like, you know, the UFC doesn't care about how many fights were streamed and seen illegally. They care about the money that was brought in. Now, of course, I'm also saying like, oh, let's give money to the company that doesn't treat them right. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what to think there. Because on one side, if we buy the pay-per-view, we're encouraging the company that doesn't pay its fighters. And on the other side, if we don't pay for a pay-per-view or if we boycott the product, um, then the only um, leverage that some fighters have right now regarding the pay-per-views and their draw and all that is taken away from them. So I don't know if there's an easy solution there. I think as fans, it's not a very clear-cut way to do something about it. I think it's really, even though my way of doing something about it is just discussing it, being very straightforward about these things, having people over to my show to talk about these things. But I think it's really up to the fighters in this case, and it's not to wash my hands of it. Quite the contrary, um, you know, I'll keep talking about it, but it's really up to the fighters. They have to work together. That's what it is. Okay. I don't think boycotting the product. I think personally, that's the one place where maybe I disagree with Mark Hunt is if we boycott the product, it's like the UFC says, "Oh, see, you're not even a draw," and only the casuals show up for very few fighters that broke into the mainstream. And then they're the only ones who have any negotiating power. I think that's what happens if us fans start boycotting the product. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Yeah. So it's just this mess. It's just this whole mess. And as a fan, I've become very disillusioned with the whole thing. And believe me, like here, I didn't come like I didn't when I started this show. It's kind of like it forced me to kind of like look into it a bit more, and just pay a little bit more attention than I would have normally. Just forced me to. And but the thing is, I didn't come like I'm not a fan of MMA, like not understanding the the consequences for them, like the damage to their brain, their bodies, and all that. Like I'm not naive, but one thing is that aspect, but then they don't even get compensated enough for that. That's crazy. That's the part that. Like Tim Sylvia said that some fighters can't even remember their kids' names. Yeah, the least you can do is pay for a broken arm. The least you can do if there's a rematch that's interesting for women's MMA, pay for it. Just pay for it. And then you don't have to wonder why the greatest female fighter of all time wants to retire. How about that?